So, picking up where we left off, a number of factors would eventually push many Arabs into the Arab nationalist camp, where they would start actually thinking of themselves in a much more decided way as Arab. And some of this was a reaction to the to the Ottoman government and certain policies. So, at some point, um, we talked about the Tanzimat reforms, and eventually, what happened was, I think we left off with in a previous lecture with how these were brought to an end in 1878 with the new Sultan Abdulhamid II. And shortly after that, we see the emergence of a kind of secret society aimed at, kind of bringing back the kind of changes that had been initiated by the Tanzimat, inclusive of constitutional government and so forth. The name of this organization was the Committee of Union and Progress, which eventually led a coup, came to power in 1908, and kind of with the idea of picking up where they left off. And initially, they were very popular. There was much support, including among the Arab population, or I might say Arabic speaking population, for the kind of constitutionalism they were promoting. They did bring back the parliament and the constitution and had elections and so forth. But at some point, a major aspect of the kind of reforms they wanted was greater centralization, right, where the government in the center in Constantinople would have more direct authority throughout the empire, and a lot of these kinds of centralizing policies would end up being greatly resented, right? So, initially a secret society, they did bring back a lot of the kind of constitutional reforms that had been initiated by the Tanzimat. But the centralization, very often, the problem with it is it tended to emphasize the kind of Turkish element of administration and of the government. And so it was kind of, and that's partly also at some point very much dominated by kind of the movement dominated by kind of the Turkish element, hence why often referred to as the Young Turks. So this kind of centralization, it's not clear. A lot of historians debate whether, this was entirely by intent or more just kind of a consequence of centralization, but was often associated with a policy known as Turkification. Right, so Turkification, kind of the idea that in order to have centralized control, we all first of all need to be using the same language of administration, being Ottoman Turkish. And related to that, emphasizing in state schools, and you're starting to see a proliferation of state schools throughout the empire, right, that they should have the same curriculum, and that the curriculum should be taught in Turkish as well, right? So, particularly in the Arab parts of the empire, there was kind of a resentment of this kind of imposition of the Turkish language in their territories, where up till then they pretty much done everything administratively in Arabic, and kind of it wasn't important whether you did things exactly the same way as in the center. So first of all, a lot of Arabic-speaking individuals' political careers were affected by this, right? I mean, it's kind of like if you don't learn Turkish, you can't keep your position in the administration. And this might also see individuals who did speak Turkish kind of move ahead of you. And then there was just kind of a general resentment of losing this semi-autonomous status. Kind of a feeling that Arabic should be one of the preeminent languages of the empire as well, particularly by this point when really the two largest groups, ethnically and linguistically in the empire, are Turkish and Arabic. And then there were some who, just because they were more kind of conservative minded, they just resented the kind of secular nature of the Cup's reforms. And then there were Christians who just didn't like this kind of, centralization of authority, particularly, for instance, in areas like Lebanon, where by this point the Christian population was somewhat autonomous. And then you might remember, of course, under the millet system, Christians had been allowed a certain degree of self rule or autonomy. So there were just a lot of different groups that aren't happy with this, and they're going to be much more open to what Arab nationalism has to offer. Now, I mentioned that this kind of secular model of Arab nationalism that we already talked about is going to have limited appeal, particularly among many Muslims for whom their Muslim identity is still very important. but we are going to see the development of a kind of more Muslim strain of Arab national identity. And we could say that kind of begins with a fellow named Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. So first of all, he came from Iran and kind of invented his name, possibly to kind of draw attention away from the fact that he was from Iran. He was Sunni and perhaps didn't want anyone to, mistake him for being Shiite. In any event, and he also ended up in exile because he was part of a plot to assassinate the Shah, and at some point ends up in Egypt where he begins to promote certain ideas as a political activist and develops kind of a following, right? So, some disciples who are going to then kind of take his ideas and modify them. So his main contribution to this development is he kind of promoted this movement called Asabiyya, or political solidarity. And his argument was that the main problem confronting the Middle East and many parts of the Muslim world was that there was a lack of unity among Muslims, right? That they needed to have more political unity in order to counter and resist European domination. And most historians who studied him feel that this really wasn't about Islam per se. It was just that he felt that it was, probably the one single denominator they all shared that lent itself to kind of the development of a kind of political movement of opposition. And so something, so it's kind of a means to an end. It isn't about Islam in and of itself. And some historians have argued that if someone had persuaded him that, for instance, a kind of more secular form of nationalism would be more effective in this regard, he would have jettisoned Islam in a second in favor of that. Of course, that's a bit counterfactual, so we don't know if that's actually the case. But he did develop a number of disciples who really tried to use this idea of asabiya and even to develop it ideologically further. One person who tried to apply it almost immediately, and again, remember he ended up being based in Cairo, and so he was kind of around, and his followers were around during the Urabi movement. So one of his disciples, a fellow named Abdallah al-Nadim, really tried to use this idea of asabiya to incite the Egyptian population to rise up against the English. Um, and he really emphasized kind of Islam as defining a shared civilization, one inclusive, not just of Muslims, but of Christians and Jews. And we should note that Egyptian nationalism, particularly during its early stages, really tried to emphasize a kind of feeling of solidarity between its Muslim, Christian, and Jewish components. So you'd see a lot of demonstrations, for instance, where people would be raising flags that would have, the crescent of Islam combined with the cross of Christianity and the Magen David, or often called the Star of David of Judaism, right? So again, this is a point worth emphasizing. They're talking about Islam as defining kind of a civilization, right? Shared values and so forth. Not in a kind of very narrow way as only corresponding to people who have certain beliefs and practices. Now, among al-Afghani's disciples, probably the most important are going to be Mohammed Abdullah, and then his disciple, actually, Muhammad Rashid Ridda, who developed a movement known as Salafiyya. Right, so both of them are highly educated individuals, and very learned in the faith of Islam, but also kind of in Islamic law and so forth, but also want reform. Right, so this movement of Salafiyya, literally meaning a return to the way of the ancestors, right? So they come up with this kind of basic notion, right, that the problem really, why Islam has not been a sound basis for political unity, or as a basis for reform, or as a basis for resisting European domination, is simply that it has become too corrupted, right? It's just become uh, too much about kind of superstitious practices, or kind of just kind of the mechanical recitation of belief and so forth. We need to get back to a pure Islam, right? To strip it away of kind of all these kind of practices and superstitions that have accumulated over the centuries. And that means getting back to the Islam practiced by Muhammad and his immediate successors. And what they really mean by this is the Islam of the Arabs. They basically say that everything that went wrong with Islam and the Islamic world, this all began when the Turks started to come into the region, right? That they had somehow corrupted it, and over the centuries had made it weaker and weaker. right? So within this framework, the Arab community not only represent this kind of pure Islam, and by the way, they really see this as kind of, like when the Arabs were ruling, this was like kind of a golden age of Islamic civilization. And this, by the way, is kind of an idea that had really existed for a while in Islam, but usually corresponded only to Muhammad and the first four caliphs, known as the Rashidun, right, the four righteous caliphs. They're now kind of extending this idea to include Arab rule right up till the end of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258, right? That this is actually the golden age. And in order for the Islamic world to rise up again, the Arabs have a special role, right, to reform Islam so that it might provide the basis for a kind of progressive movement. So that's the other thing we need to know also, right? Salafiyah, it is about getting back to a pure Islam, but not in a very literal sense, right? They're really saying to get back to certain basic principles that would then provide an indigenous foundation, a native foundation for moving forward, right, on the basis of our own principles, right, rather than this kind of idea of imitating or borrowing from Europe. Though, I mean, there's kind of the idea too. Mohammed Abdullah, for instance, would argue that, look, a lot of what's best in Europe originally came from here, so there's nothing wrong with borrowing it back, but we need to do it on our own terms, right? So, in a sense, this also provides a foundation for an Arab nationalism rooted in Islam, where the thing that defines the Arabs as a people is kind of the idea that they are the Muslim community or ummah par excellence, right? Kind of represent perfect Muslim community, and they have a special mission to reform Islam as a basis for moving forward. Now, of course, for Muhammad Abdul, this idea of reforming Islam, that yes, the Arabs would take the lead, but it's for the benefit of all Muslims, regardless of what their background. But eventually, it does really kind of focus more on this idea of the Arabs having a special role to play. And a lot of that development is going to become evident during the First World War. In any event, it certainly provides a model of Arab national identity that could prove very appealing to someone of a Muslim background for whom their Muslim faith is a very important aspect of their sense of who they are, right? So a lot of this development, though, is really things are really going to start to take off during the First World War, right? So the First World War begins in 1914. The Ottoman Empire enters the war almost right from the beginning on the side of the Central Powers, right? So they're going to be fighting alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary. In many ways, this decision simply reflects a kind of, the enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So this means they're now fighting against the British, French, and the Russians, all three of with whom they have issues. Russia, of course, has been kind of the arch nemesis of the Ottoman Empire from the beginning for quite a while. So there's kind of a feeling that we might have a chance to reclaim some lost territory. They resent the British presence in Egypt, and both the British and French have been probably the two most dominant imperial presences in the region, though also Russia. But our focus, of course, here is going to be on the growing role of Arab nationalism, and that eventually the Arabs are going to take part in a resistance movement known as the Arab Revolt against the Ottoman Empire alongside the British. In theory, the idea is that they're fighting for their independence, right? But in order to understand kind of the outcome of all of this, we need to focus on three different documents. I like to call this a tale of three documents because these documents, in many ways, are going to lay the foundation for the modern Middle East as we know it today, and are especially relevant with respect to, kind of what Arab nationalism and the Arab Revolt are able to achieve, right? So the three documents in question are, and I've given these out. You'll find them on Blackboard. I'd really like you to take a close look at them. In fact, you might even pull them out while you're watching this, so maybe hit the pause button for a second. Right, but the three documents in question are the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the Balfour Declaration. So, the first document, the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, bears the name of the two individuals who were communicating with one another and a series of letters. The one, Hussein, to be more precise, Hussein Bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, and we'll get to what that signified in a moment, representing Arab nationalists, and on the other side, a fellow named McMahon, who was representing the British government. And he had a kind of official position in the Sudan at that time. So, shortly after the First World War started, the British started thinking about how they might take advantage of Arab nationalist sentiment in the Ottoman Empire to perhaps inspire an Arab revolt against the Ottoman government as part of their war effort. Bearing in mind, remembering that the Ottoman Empire is aligned with the Central Powers against who the British, French, and Russians are fighting. The question became, who could they communicate with that might represent all Arab nationalists? And at some point they settled on the Sharif and Emir of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali. And this actually signified an actual position within the Ottoman government. Sharif, literally meaning kind of an indication of someone being descended from the Prophet, from Muhammad, and Emir meaning prince. But in terms of being an official position, Hussein was responsible for the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina on behalf of the Ottoman government. At the same time, he had his own political ambitions, and he, obviously represented a rather kind of a high figure within the Arab world. The big question is whether he actually spoke on behalf of Arab nationalists. Most Arab nationalists at this point are based in Syria, and all indications are that Hussein himself was not exactly a strong proponent of Arab nationalism, but there is also plenty of indication that he was in communication with Arab nationalists in Syria, and at some point really was kind of operating on their behalf, consulting with them about anything that he actually wrote or agreed to with respect to the British. Right, so the basic idea was that the British would support Arab independence after the war in return for a revolt led by the Arabs against the Ottoman government. Right, so the correspondence that took place at that time, in many respects, concerned what would be the nature of that support, and in some ways more interesting for in light of other developments that are going to take place, which territories would be part of a future independent Arab state or confederacy of states. And so it wasn't just one letter, right? You have like letters going back and forth. And a big part of the negotiation was which territories the British were prepared to recognize as part of an independent Arab state. Certainly would have included what today is Syria, where again, this was an area where there was really very rapidly growing support for breaking away from the Ottoman Empire, in part because of the harsh rule of the Ottoman governor in Syria at that time, Jamal Pasha, who really went after anyone he thought might be an Arab nationalist, to the point of having large numbers of them executed publicly. And this actually kind of turned people against the Ottoman Empire. Now you might be also, so Hussein does kind of represent the Arab nationalists in this negotiation. McMahon definitely representing the British position, right? There's nothing that he's actually promising without first consulting with the government in London. So again, a big part of this negotiation concerned which territories would be part of a future Arab state. And at some point, the main sticking point became roughly what corresponds to modern-day Lebanon, right? So at some point, the British basically said that there were certain territories that they just couldn't recognize in some sense as being Arab, or in any event would support as being part of an Arab state. The wording in the document, the key wording in one of the letters, portions lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, right? So you might draw a line through those cities on the map, and then just imagine everything to the west cannot be said to be purely Arab and should be excluded from the limits demanded. Right, so this was one of the letters from McMahon dated October 24th, 1915. So here's the problem. It's not clear what is meant by the term district, because these cities don't really correspond to any kind of administrative district within the Ottoman Empire.
And later on, the British are going to maintain that they intended not only to exclude what corresponds to Lebanon, but they also meant to exclude what corresponds to Palestine. On that map, what's indicated as Israel. And they would make all kinds of very kind of technical legalese arguments about how that line drawn through those cities should just be considered as extending further southward. The Arabs, of course, would not see it that way. From their point of view, the British had never indicated that they didn't intend for Palestine to be part of an Arab state. Certainly after the Arab Revolt got underway and as they pushed north into Palestine, British officers would encourage Arabs there to rise up and take part in the revolt, and certainly they understood they were fighting for their own independence. But nonetheless, this would become a major point of contention. Finally, I should note that Hussein never even agreed to the exclusion of the territories corresponding to Lebanon, right? But at some point, there was kind of a recognition that if there's going to be an Arab revolt, it needs to get underway. So let's just agree to disagree, and we'll kind of come back to that at a later point. And indeed, the Arab Revolt began on June 5th, 1916, under the leadership of Sharif Hussein, but also his sons would be very active in the field. And so that date is actually when the Sharif Hussein declared the Arabs independent of Ottoman rule. Large number of British officers would participate in this. One of them would become quite famous, a officer named T.E. Lawrence, who would become very famous, known as Lawrence of Arabia. Some of you might be familiar with the movie that came out that won all kinds of Academy Awards. I believe it was 1962. Well worth seeing, though maybe not entirely historically accurate. But much kind of romanticized aspect of the First World War. And primarily so that brings us to the next document, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which in some ways has its beginning with Russian territorial ambitions with respect to the Ottoman Empire. And again, well, actually, I didn't mention this, but you might recall that the British policy with respect to the Ottoman Empire up until the First World War was to maintain the integrity and to support the continued existence of the Ottoman Empire. With the beginning of the war and the Ottoman Empire's entry into that war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, it was generally considered that the Ottoman Empire wouldn't survive. And it was recognized that different European powers had different interests. So there was kind of an agreement that, rather than fighting over the spoils after the war, why don't we decide in advance who's going to get what? And it was pretty much understood that if the Ottoman Empire completely collapsed, that the Russians had probably the strongest claim on Constantinople/Istanbul, partly because of its historic connection to Orthodox Christianity. The vast majority of Russians, being Russian Orthodox, kind of always saw themselves as the inheritor of, kind of like Constantinople had been the second Rome, Moscow was the third Rome, and so forth. So it was kind of agreed that the Russians would get access to, would get control even of Constantinople. This also reflected a desire on the part of Russia to have access to the Mediterranean, right? So in gaining control of Istanbul, they'd also have control of the Bosphorus, which is that tiny passageway right next to Istanbul on the map. And then at the other end of the Sea of Marmara, the Dardanelles, which then would permit entry into the Mediterranean. That left the British and French to negotiate their respective interests regarding the Ottoman Empire. And these pretty much corresponded to the Arab territories. And here's the thing, right? So Sykes-Picot reflects the fact, the name reflects the fact that the British were represented in this negotiation by a fellow named Sykes, the French by a fellow named Picot, and this is a secret agreement, right? The Russians are privy to it. Their interests are already taken into account even before they sat down. But beyond that, this agreement is not known by any party, including the Arabs, right? So this is happening, in a sense, behind their back. And basically, the agreement is about how to divide up the Arab territories between the two of them. And so kind of a key passage that gives you an idea of what's going on, that France and Great Britain are prepared to recognize and protect an independent Arab state or a confederation of Arab states in the areas A and B. that in Area A, France, and in Area B, Great Britain shall alone supply advisors or foreign functionaries at the request of the Arab state or Confederation of Arab States. You might be saying, well, it sounds like they are talking about some kind of independent Arab states or state, but that actually isn't the case, right? So first of all, the idea is the blue area would fall under France's jurisdiction, the red area under Great Britain. What you see there, kind of the light blue, light red, those would be pseudo-independent Arab states, separate from one another. I mean, half of it is aligned with France, the other half with Britain. And both the British and French would have tremendous control over what they were able to do. And then the dark blue and the dark red would be under direct French and British control. And so, I mean, those would effectively be colonies. The yellow area, roughly corresponding to Palestine, present-day Israel-Palestine, would be an international zone, and this pretty much reflected the fact that the city of Jerusalem and some of the surrounding area was just too important to too many different religions, so nobody would accept it being under the control of one European power. Right? So again, a secret agreement. Later on, the British would maintain that nothing here contradicted what had been promised in the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. But I think you really have to do make a really pretty sophisticated, very kind of technical legal argument to somehow make the case that this does not contradict what was promised as far as Arab independence. And certainly it went against the spirit of that negotiation, right? But again, it's a secret agreement. It will eventually be revealed to the Arabs. At the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the revolutionaries find a copy of this agreement in the vault, and they decide it'd be a pretty good idea to publish it, to make it public, in order to embarrass Britain and France. And as you might imagine, it was perceived very negatively by the Arabs. And that brings us to the third document, the Balfour Declaration, which takes its name from the name of the foreign minister at the time. This document was produced in November of 1917, and the minister at the time was Arthur Balfour, but we should be clear about this. This is a statement of British policy. This is not the opinion of Arthur Balfour, his own personal views or anything of that nature. And so, I mean, this represents very much a commitment on the part of the British government. So what is the Balfour Declaration about? In order to really fully appreciate it, we need to provide a bit of background regarding the movement known as Zionism, which hopefully from the reading you'll have a pretty clear sense of it, but probably the simplest basic definition of it is Jewish nationalism, right? The idea that the Jews constitute an actual nation, a people, as opposed to simply constituting a religion. This might seem a bit strange to some people, but it's helpful to understand that particularly during the latter part of the 19th century, in some parts of Europe, particularly kind of the further east you went, if you're talking about Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Russian Empire at that time, Jews were perceived as a distinct people. And even to some degree, that's the case today. So for instance, at least until very recently, I haven't checked on it, but as of a few years ago, if you were a Russian born, say, in Moscow, and a citizen then of the Russian Federation, in your passport, where it would indicate Russian for someone else, for you it would indicate Jewish. And this really had nothing to do, hasn't even till now, has nothing to do with religious belief. You might in fact be an atheist, but still, this would be how you viewed yourself as well, how the people around you viewed you. So some people are Russian, you have Georgians, Armenians, Jews, and so forth. And so it might not be surprising then that this kind of Jewish nationalist movement known as Zionism really first sunk roots in Eastern Europe. Even though eventually the guy who kind of pulled it together into an organized movement would be an Austrian Jew named Theodor Herzl. And that's kind of towards the end of the 19th century. And then it became much more organized also in the sense of, representatives coming together once a year with the World Zionist Organization, but also soliciting the support of great powers. And eventually what we see here is they're succeeding at getting British support,
Up until this point, their primary activity has been trying to establish settlements of Jews in Palestine, right? So it's not just the idea that Jews are a nation, but the idea that they deserve their own state, and based with kind of the biblical history, and the Bible being seen here more as a historical document than a religious one. The idea that that state should be in the quote unquote Holy Land, what they would call Eretz Yisrael, and what at that time was just commonly referred to as Palestine, part of the Ottoman Empire, and so forth. Um, please don't mind these sound effects. But in any event, by the time we get to the First World War, you have about 10% of the population there is Jewish. But this is a big deal, getting support from one of the biggest powers in the world at that time. But what is it exactly the British are agreeing to support? So we look at this document, and we actually have the whole thing here. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So first of all, what is a national home? This is a diplomatic document, right? So this is not some unintentional vague language. If it meant that all of Palestine was to become a Jewish state, then they would have said a Jewish state in Palestine, or Palestine being converted into a Jewish state, or something in that vein. National home could mean that. It could mean a Jewish state in some part of Palestine. It could mean simply that the Jews would have some kind of formalized political status in Palestine. It is intentionally vague. That is by design. And part of this reflects a recognition that the indigenous inhabitants, the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, probably aren't going to be too happy with this. Well, in any event, continuing, that Britain will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. This part is actually referring to what British policy will be in practice. Basically, that it should facilitate two things looking forward. And by the way, by 1917, the British have militarily occupied Palestine. So they do have a certain measure of control about what happens there. And from this map, I should also indicate that Palestine at this point includes what today we would consider to be the state of Jordan. So in any event, the British would be facilitating two things. On the one hand, Jewish immigration to Palestine. On the other hand, their ability to purchase land, with the idea of kind of, brick by brick laying the foundation for, some point in the far future, they would have imagined then maybe the creation of a Jewish state. Returning to the document, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. I'd like you to think about this for a second. First of all, they don't refer to the Arabs of Palestine as Arabs. They are simply the non-Jewish communities. Complete lack of recognition of them as a people. Second of all, nothing is said about their political rights. Again, none of this is by accident, right? This is by design. And then finally, that nothing would be done to prejudice the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And I should note at this point that most Jews are not Zionists. They don't support Zionism. Many are, in fact, very concerned about this idea of promoting that the Jews are somehow a distinct people. This could become a justification for anti-Semitism, kind of anti-Jewish sentiment. Many Jews, particularly in Western Europe, the United States, have kind of, were finally brought into the fold, are considered a part of those national identities where their Jewish identity simply defines their faith. So they're kind of like, do we really want to promote the idea that the Jews are a distinct people when we finally were, kind of accepted among the populations where we live? So that's the essence of the Balfour Declaration. And so those are the three documents that we've been talking about. Well, we do need to look at a fourth document because it's going to have a tremendous amount of bearing after the First World War, and that would be Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Woodrow Wilson, of course, being the American president that brought the United States into the First World War at a much later date from when it started. But in any event, I mean, part of the problem was Americans did not want to get involved in that conflict, so we kind of needed to sell it. And so what he promoted, and the 14 points are initially addressed to the American people via the Congress, is delivered at a joint session of the Congress on January 8th, 1918. And basically saying we're getting involved in this war to help create a new international order, one wherein war will never happen again, right? So there are 14 different principles that he promotes that should form the basis of a new international order. I want to look at two of them here. The first, open covenants of peace openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understandings of any kind, but diplomacy shall proceed always frankly and in the public view, right? So agreements should be done in the open. Basically saying that agreements like Sykes-Picot are illegitimate, right? So in theory, Sykes-Picot should be null and void. This was all done in back rooms. It wasn't done in any kind of transparent way, and that in and of itself is sufficient to make it null and void. Point 5, a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observation of the principle that in, and this is the key part, determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. To put it more simply, if you're going to establish imperial or colonial control over a territory, you have to first get the permission of the people who live there. In other words, whatever kind of political arrangement you're coming up with, the people who live there, the indigenous native population, should have the final word. This will end up defining in some ways what will be the guiding principle after the First World War, at least particularly as far as colonized people are concerned. The principle of national self-determination, right? That each people should have the right to determine its own political future. So that brings us to the Paris Peace Conference. And Wilson's 14 points, initially directed at the American public, actually becomes in some ways the defining theme of the Paris Peace Conference, or certainly it represents the American position there. And certainly it's really going to have tremendous support, not just among non-European peoples who want to, eliminate European control or prevent it from happening if it hasn't yet, but also many Europeans who kind of feel like, it's really a bloody conflict. Surely it must be for something other than just, the spoils of war. On the other hand, there are going to be some leaders there who, pretty much, let's say, old school. So, for instance, David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, and George Clemenceau, the French representative, they're kind of old school. They're like, we both spent a lot of blood and treasure on this conflict. We want compensation. We want territory, right? And the Ottoman Empire is gone. Via Sykes-Picot, they'd kind of worked out their respective claims. So they kind of expect that, now we won the conflict, to us go the spoils of war. But also representing various interests there will be people like Chaim Weizmann. He's there representing Zionist claims, right, in connection with Palestine. And he does have British support, but he's kind of operating on this idea of national self-determination, that the Jews have the right to determine their own future. Problematic is that they want to do it in a territory already claimed by another people. Heading the Arab delegation will be Faisal, the son of Hussein, of the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. He had become one of the leading or leaders of the Arab Revolt, and so now he's going to go to Paris to represent Arab claims. And of course, basically he's saying the Arabs want to have their own independent state, much as the British had promised them in Hussein-McMahon. It's a rather small picture, perhaps, but to his left, standing behind him, is T.E. Lawrence, who went there in theory as an interpreter, but more to kind of help him navigate European politics. And Woodrow Wilson, of course, is also there, and many of these other delegations, not just the Arabs, you're going to have an Egyptian delegation there, you're having delegations coming from India, from Vietnam, and so forth, many looking to the American president for support on the basis of this principle of national self-determination. Now, in the case of the former Ottoman territories, and just to be clear, by the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire still kind of exists, but it's only this very kind of small territory, even smaller than the current state of Turkey. Also, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire has crumbled. Russia's in the middle of a civil conflict, so they're not really kind of involved in this. But there really is a lot to be decided regarding the fate of various territories. Of course, in this course, we're interested primarily in former Ottoman territory. And Woodrow Wilson really promotes the idea like, well, we need to ascertain, we need to find out what the indigenous inhabitants of the former Ottoman Empire want. And both Clemenceau for the French and Lloyd George for the British are having none of it. They insist that the Arabs would be quite happy to have them there, kind of looking out for them. Um, but Woodrow Wilson really kind of pushes this idea of, we need to find out what they want. Let's put together a commission, send some people there to interview people, talk to them, and find out what they want. The British and French kind of reluctantly agree, but they never actually appoint anyone. So what we end up with is a purely American commission known as the King-Crain Commission. So it's made up entirely of Americans. So off they go to the Ottoman Empire, not just the Arab territories, but those are probably the areas that they're most operative in, and basically asking them, what do you want? So what they find is, if they could have anything they want complete independence under Faisal. With their capital in Damascus, Faisal would be king, kind of the hero of the Arab Revolt. If there must be any foreign control, their first preference would be the Americans. And today this might seem odd, but at that point the United States had had very limited involvement in the Middle East, and were kind of trusted, particularly given that Woodrow Wilson was promoting this idea of national self-determination. After that, they're like, fine, if it has to be someone else, then the British, who already militarily occupied most of the region and who they felt they could trust somewhat, but under no circumstances did they want the French. And of course, based on Sykes-Picot, the French are laying claim to most of what today is Syria and Lebanon. Finally, they asked them about Zionism. And many Zionists were quite convinced and certainly sought to convince others that most of the Arab population wouldn't have a problem with large numbers of Jews coming there. Anybody who was like kind of creating trouble in that regard, these were like individual troublemakers. And in fact, they were saying most Arabs aren't even really that aware of Zionism as a movement. This is completely not true, in fact. And first of all, this was an issue that was being discussed at great length in the Arabic language press, particularly in Palestine. They were quite aware of what the intentions were of Zionism and of the growing Jewish population there. But in any event, the commission found out as well, right, that the local Arab population both really was quite aware of Zionism and strongly opposed to it. They produced their report, and pretty much it ended up on a shelf where nobody read it. So how did things conclude then? On the one hand, you have the United States promoting national self-determination, which is incredibly popular among even many Europeans, but certainly in the non-European world. On the other side, you have kind of old school leaders like Clemenceau and Lloyd George who are demanding basically colonies from these former territories, also from territories that had been taken from Germany, former German colonies. I should note the Japanese also had their eye on some German colonies in the Pacific. Well, it didn't help that Woodrow Wilson ended up having a stroke, and that kind of put him out of commission. But it's kind of somehow hard to imagine things would have turned out differently. What they kind of came up with is a compromise known as the mandatory system, right, whereby former territories of the Ottoman Empire as well as former German colonies would be put under the control of one or another great power. So effectively, they are colonies, but in every case, the great power in question has an obligation to prepare said territory for eventual independence. And this ends up being formalized at the San Remo Conference that's held in April of 1920. You have a newly created League of Nations, so they basically legitimize this whole kind of mandatory system and award different territories as mandates for administration by one or another European power. This certainly is the case in formerly Ottoman-ruled lands. Syria, inclusive of Lebanon, will go to France. And there is no Lebanon yet, it's part of Syria. Iraq and Palestine, which again includes pretty much present day Jordan, would go to the British, and the Arabs would have a completely independent state in the Hijaz, a smallish region around Mecca and Medina, certainly much less than the Arabs imagined they were fighting for during the Arab Revolt. The Ottoman government is forced to accept these arrangements as presented in the Treaty of Sèvres, which is signed in August 1920. Ottoman Empire will eventually completely disappear in 1923. We'll get to that later. But let's finish with a look at what actually has been worked out on the ground. I put these two maps here so you can kind of see that the mandates awarded to the French and British roughly correspond to what had been worked out in Sykes-Picot, right? So Syria, inclusive of Lebanon, roughly corresponding to the blue zones, Iraq and Transjordan, that part of Palestine at this point, roughly corresponding to the red zone. The one major difference is that Palestine proper, what will eventually become Israel, inclusive of Jerusalem, had originally been an international zone. That is now a British mandate. And it kind of reflects the fact that the British are at this point militarily occupying Palestine, which gives them a lot of leverage as far as renegotiating what had been worked out with Sykes-Picot. So, okay, you might be thinking, well, you know, they're not getting independence right away, but eventually it will happen. But there are two problems with this. First of all, with the mandates, there are no timetables. The British and French will decide on their own unilaterally when the Arabs under their rule are ready for independence. Second of all, nothing is actually stipulated as to what independence means. And we're going to learn as we move forward that in many cases independence is of the most superficial kind, where both, you know, either the British or the French are still going to maintain a tremendous amount of influence and control. As far as any kind of truly independent Arab state, well, this is what we have. As of the conclusion of the First World War, this is really the only truly independent Arab state on the map. Uh, there is no Saudi Arabia yet. Arabia had been part of the Ottoman Empire, inclusive of Mecca and Medina. The Hijaz is only that portion of Arabia along the Red Sea. And that will be under the control of the now king of the Hijaz, Hussein, formerly of the Hussein McMahon correspondence.